And then I had people who would go on TV, scientists who would do like press conferences with the government saying, oh, our model showed that the curfew has saved, X number of lives. And I was like, are you serious? Like, your model is total crap, Like anyone who understand, like, really, like the most basic statistics, can tell that this doesn't show anything. And they were pretending that those completely garbage methods, like scientifically demonstrated, whatever that meant, that, this was effective and was saving like thousands and thousands of lives. And this is either like total incompetence or dishonesty.
Welcome to Manifold. My guest today is Philippe Lemoine, who is a PhD candidate at Cornell in philosophy and also a well-read public intellectual. He writes both, I think, for magazines and also on his own Substack. I had many suggestions from listeners to have Philippe on the podcast. Let me first ask you, Philippe, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Correctly enough.
I still have some remnants of high school French, so
yeah, much better than most Americans, I will say.
Yes, my French teacher would be proud of me, I guess. So let me start by asking you about your background. And as I was just mentioning to you before we started recording, people in my generation, intellectuals and American intellectuals and academics from my generation, had a certain fascination with France. And the idea that, intellectualism still survives in France and things like this. So tell us a little bit about your childhood and how you came to Cornell and how you view the world as somebody who, has maybe one foot in France and one foot in the United States.
Okay. So I have a somewhat unusual background, at least insofar as my studies are concerned. I was... I remember being in high school, hesitating. So I started programming when I was like 14 or something. So I was really into programming as a teenager. So like typical nerdy kid in that respect. But I also liked physics a lot when I was in high school. So I remember hesitating between physics and computer science, for university. In high school, I took the path of least resistance, which was computer science, because I already knew most of the stuff. So I studied computers. I did a Bachelor of Computer Science initially. Then what happened is, before that, I don't know. I feel like in that respect, I had the life of a nerdy kid, which would be similar in France to what it was in the US. Maybe we can talk about the role of intellectuals in public life in France and the US. This, I think, is different, but I don't think it really affected my childhood, for instance. So anyway, I went, did a Bachelor in Computer Science. By the end, it was that I stopped liking computer science, I still do. But I realized that this was probably not something I wanted to do professionally. And it was more of a hobby than something I wanted to do as a job, And I had this friend, it was in this French school, where with a well-known French school where you do political science with a bit of everything, economics, history. What I discovered later is that you do a bit of everything because you do a bit of everything very poorly. And that's why you can, but anyway, of course I didn't know that at the time. I just could see that. And, it sounded good for me because for two reasons, basically. One, because I wasn't sure, like I said, I had become convinced that I didn't want to do computer science professionally, but I didn't know for sure what I did want to do. And the problem wasn't really that I had no idea about what I wanted to do. The problem was rather the opposite, that I had too many because I was interested in like a lot of different things. And so the appeal of this school was that precisely because you get to do a lot of different things, I figured, and also it's fairly prestigious. So I figured, it would both give me the opportunity to try a variety of topics and also leave me a maximum of doors open after that, because it's fairly prestigious. And another appeal was that you can enter like via competitive exams directly in third year. At least at the time you could. I don't know how it works now. So I could just study on the side, for the exam while I was finishing my bachelor in computer science, and then get in directly in third year rather than start at the beginning. That was another appeal of the school question.
The school's Po? CS is Po?
Sciences Po, yeah, Sciences Po. So, okay. So I did that. I got into that school. And then, like I said, I mean, I liked it a lot, but I was disappointed by the classes. But I liked it a lot because I could study on the, like even if I thought the courses were not, very superficial in general, if you're willing to study on your own, you can, you don't even need a school really. But I guess, so I did learn a lot of stuff, and I suppose you could say that it was prompted by the topics I had to study for classes, but a lot of it was like stuff I would read on my own. Not all of it, I don't want to be like, there were some good classes, but it's just like in general, like I remember taking a macroeconomics class, for instance, and to give you an example, like I remember the exam was a multiple choice questionnaire type of exam. And so what students would do, so, we'd go over the basic models of like standard macroeconomics. And so, you would get asked questions, suppose you're in model X, model summing or whatever. And, with two country A and B, and like there is a shock in country B, and like, okay, according to the model, what's going to be the effect in country A, or, And so, what almost every student, I say almost every, because it's not even that I know even one other person who didn't do that besides me, but I'm assuming there has to be some, like, over 100 students in the class. They would just like go over the exams from previous years and learn by heart all the possible questions and all the possible answer, and then just answer the. Of course, this gives you no understanding of the models that you're supposed to learn in the class. Whereas, the more economical and smarter way of like doing this kind of exam is you learn the equation of the model and just you derive the answer to the question from the equation. It's just, those models are not very complicated. But almost nobody does it because it's not incentivized by the way it's taught and the way you're graded. Because also you have very limited time to do this multiple choice questionnaire thing. So if you learn by heart, you actually have an advantage, an edge over someone who has to derive the thing every time. So, just to give you an example of how the way in that school, and I think it's fairly common, the way in which the teaching works and the exams work did not incentivize actually understanding the material. Which I think is really bad. And so that's what I meant earlier when I said that you do a lot of things, but very superficially. And so people who get out of this school, they can talk very convincingly about pretty much anything for 5 minutes. And when it gets beyond 5 minutes, then it starts like to collapse because you start to realize that they have no idea what they're talking about. It's amazing.
Must be a great feeder for McKinsey and other consulting companies.
It actually is. A lot of people go there after that. It's also a great feeder for French politics, which explains a lot, if you ask me. But so anyway, after this, it was useful to me, because like I said, I did get to study like a lot of things, during those years. And it also helped me. So, at the time I was considering economics a lot, I figured while I was there, I wanted to do a PhD. I just wasn't sure in what field. And I remember history, economics were topics I was seriously considering. But in the end, I decided to go for philosophy. After reading Aristotle totally by chance, I read the back cover of the Physics of Aristotle. And there was a quote by Heidegger, who I've read and therefore hate with like a deep passion. But at the time, I had never read him, and all I knew is that he was this famous German philosopher, and he was saying on the back cover something like, "This is probably, arguably, the most important book in Western Western metaphysics or something like that. I was like, okay, so I should probably read it. And I thought I was gonna read it in 2 weeks, and then move on to the next thing. But it was kind of a revelation. I was really impressed by it, and it was really challenging. Like I ended up spending all summer on it. I wrote like some kind of like summary/commentary of it that ran like well over 100 pages just to reconstruct the argument. And I remember being very impressed by how clever he was. Like, I mean, I still think he was one of the smartest people who ever lived it. I think it's very impressive. Um, and also thought it was fascinating to put myself in the head of someone who didn't know about modern physics. And so had like the completely different way of theoretical scheme to understand the physical world. And that was really interesting because it really helped me appreciate better both the achievement that constituted my modern physics, but also how we got there. Because, we did build, if you look later, I read more stuff on how the specialists of the issue, but I read more stuff about the history of physics. And it's really interesting to see how you have like, nominalist physicists in the Middle Ages who build like something that it's the beginnings of like what will become calculus, and like they build on this. And so it's a very gradual, we have this image of the scientific revolution with this like neat fear break with the previous physics, but that's not at all how it actually happened. In a sense, it was a break, but it wasn't nearly as neat and it built on previous stuff. And so it's very interesting to look at, Aristotelian physics and then how it evolved over time, because that's another like cliche that it was a fixed things, but no, people like, there was innovation within that framework, or paradigm, as Kuhn would say. And he did like, although, there was a change of paradigm, but there was some continuity to it. So yeah, that was interesting for both of those reasons. So I went to do philosophy in France. So I don't know if you're aware of this distinction in philosophy. There are two like schools in contemporary philosophy or tradition, I guess. One is called continental philosophy. The other is called analytic philosophy, and analytic philosophy dominates in the Anglo-Saxon world, whereas continental philosophy dominates on the continent and especially in France. The names are actually funny because analytic philosophy was born in Austria, it's hard to get more continental than that, but no, it's more accurate, I suppose. And so I was never really into continental philosophy because it always struck me as like gibberish, and I don't know, it's just like, and it didn't interest me, Aristotle was different, I was like, okay, this guy is making real arguments. It's hard to reconstruct them often, but you can, make plausible reconstruction. I read Heidegger and I have no idea what's going on here. And honestly, I don't believe anyone does. But so I wasn't really interested in continental philosophy, but I also didn't know analytic philosophy because especially at the time, in France, it was almost non-existent. Not quite, but almost. So I was mostly doing history of philosophy. And then by chance, basically because I heard people bash analytic philosophy, saying that, they thought that you could reduce philosophy to logic. And I was like, sure, that sounds dumb. Like, the philosophy can be reduced to logic, but I should probably read about this stuff to see for myself, what this is about. And so I read a book called Companion to Analytic Philosophy. I don't remember the name of the author, which was an overview of like contemporary analytic philosophy. And of course, I immediately loved it. So in my case, the criticizing incessantly analytic philosophy kind of backfired because it made me look into it, and I really loved it. So that's when I decided to go to the US, basically, because like I said, in France, it's not that there is no analytic philosophy whatsoever, but there is little of it. There are a few places where they do that. If you want to get a scholarship, it's difficult when you don't know anyone, and I didn't know anyone. Whereas in the US, in that sense, at least it's more meritocratic. Mm-hmm. You could write, at least in philosophy, the way it worked. The main element of your application is what they call a writing sample. So I wrote this writing sample about a topic in the philosophy of language, specifically how the reference of terms is fixed. And it's funny, I read it a few years ago. I read it again, and you can see that it almost entirely self-taught stuff. I reinvent the wheel on several occasions, so I reinvent some concept that have been invented before, but giving them like different names, like presenting them in slightly different ways and stuff. So it hardly ideal in that respect, but still, I guess it was still interesting enough that I got in at Cornell. So I went at Cornell. I was mostly, even though I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do at the time, but I already was inkling toward philosophy of science. And once I got there, I also got into logic a lot more. So I started reading more about like mathematical logic, which is really this is one of those topics where there is no clear border between, where philosophy stops, and math starts and vice versa. Because you can't, I feel like I like statistics in that respect for a similar reason, because you very quickly, when you go into statistics, very quickly you run into some epistemological questions that are really philosophical, but you can't deal with them without understanding the math either. So it's not, there's no clear separation. And in fact, people who publish in those fields frequently publish, are in philosophy department or statistics department or physics department, and publish in similar journals. And so you can see the same thing at the institutional level too, even though for practical reasons you do have those like semi-artificial like divisions, but which are inevitable, I guess. So anyway, I got into this. And I wrote a dissertation, which technically is still not finished because I should make revisions to defend the stuff on 2 chapters. But it's one of those 3-paper kind of dissertation. So you write 3. So it's 3 different papers. I won't even try to describe what the first is about because it's the most boring and uninteresting topic you can imagine. To this day, I was gonna say to this day I have no idea why I decided to work on this. Actually, I do know it's because some people were wrong and I was annoyed by it. But that's a bad reason. That's a bad reason to write about something when the underlying topic is completely uninteresting, and this one is. So anyway, the second one is something about it's about something called paraconsistent logic, which very roughly is a kind of logic that, unlike classical logic, can deal with inconsistent theories without everything going to shit, basically. Mm-hmm. And so what I do is define a new class of such logic, prove that they have such and such properties, and argue that those properties make them philosophically interesting for such and such reason.
The problem with logic doesn't immediately allow you to prove anything.
Well, I mean, you can prove something about logical systems, but that's what I do, in the thing. But then, I was much more enthusiastic about this paper when I started working on it than I am now. But I mean, I still think it's kind of interesting, but not nearly as I initially thought. I guess at this point, the one I prefer is the third paper, which is about something called the representational theory of measurement. And it's basically something that a bunch of mathematicians and psychologists mostly came up with in the 50s, 60s, although it goes back to work done by physicists at the end of the 19th century. And it's a theory that's supposed to explain how come we can describe the world and have theories that make accurate predictions about it using numbers, which is kind of puzzling when you think about it, because the world doesn't seem to be numerical in any obvious sense. And so this theory explains that it shows that if you posit that the world has certain structures in the world, then there are homomorphism between those structures and certain numerical systems. And in certain conditions, if some axioms are satisfied by the world, then you can represent it, numerically. But those guys, they came up with the theory at the height of the empiricist movement. And so they were convinced that they could show that they could interpret this the axioms in question in a purely empirical way. And I mean that in a very strong sense, that they thought that those axioms could be verified empirically in the sense that they were observable in a very strong sense. Like, so they thought that you could literally open your eyes and like verify those axioms. And then once you could assume you were in a position to assume that those axioms are true, then you get the whole apparatus where you can represent the structure numerically, and it explains why you can assign numbers to stuff like temperature or length or etc. And what I do in the paper is argue that no, actually, this interpretation is untenable. Like, you cannot interpret those axioms in such strongly empiricism. And so the picture they had is that this theory was at like was like really foundational in the sense that all the rest of science rested on this, because the rest of science uses numbers, to talk about. And so you had to first be able to establish empirically this theory before you could do the rest of science, at least logically. And so that's one of the reasons why they thought that, you had to be able to interpret those axioms as, describing like observable like state of affairs, because that meant you could verify them without needing any theoretical apparatus or other, the laws of physics or whatever.
Would you need to do all this work if you were only interested in discrete quantities, or would it be straightforward?
So, I mean, there's a lot of, like, if you look at the modern physics, it uses like continuous mathematics. Now, there are some philosophers. This is actually fascinating. I don't know this stuff very well, but there is a fantastic book, if people want to read, by Hartree Field, a philosopher called Hartree Field, that's called Science Without Numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And what he does in this book, he argues that mathematics is actually dispensable, because one of the main arguments in the philosophy of mathematics is that numbers exist because mathematics and numbers are indispensable to do our best science. And so we have this kind of like inductive reason to assume that they're true. And he says, no, actually, so he's a nominal. They know we don't. It is not indispensable. And many philosophers have argued this before, but usually they give like theoretical abstract arguments in favor of that view. But he went further. He endeavored to show concretely that you could reconstruct, at least a part of modern. So in this case, it looked like a classical gravitational theory in the potential form. Yeah. And he reconstructed it, without assuming numbers. It's very clever. It's really a great book. It's well worth reading, even if you're not a philosopher. And so yeah, I mean, there are some people who think that, you don't need as much mathematics as we use in like standard science to do the same thing. But like, there are very serious problems with this too, so there are various arguments to the effect that, yeah, you could do this with like this theory, but like if you start getting into like, say, special relativity, then you run into like the strategy used to do this with like, Newtonian gravitational theory, it's not going to work with something like, so, but maybe there are other tricks that could be, it's an interesting topic, but so far I don't think anybody has managed to do it. So going back to measurement theory, so they have this idea that, this was foundational in an epistemic sense, and like in the sense that, you need to be able to empirically verify this theory of measurement so that you could go on to do the rest of science, because the rest of science rests on like assigning numbers to physical objects or social relations or properties, etc. And so and because of that, they wanted you to be able that you would have to be able to verify empirically the theory without having to assume any of this like scientific baggage, other physical or non-physical theories. And so that's why they try to interpret the axioms of that theory in like purely observable terms, in like a very strong sense. And what I do in the paper is argue that actually this interpretation is not tenable. You have those axioms, they are theoretical in the same way that axioms of other theories, scientific theories, are theoretical. And in fact, epistemically, this theory of measurement is on a par with the other scientific theories. And what this means is that you don't empirically verify the theory independently of the others, and then you can go on to verify the others. You verify everything in a packet. So it's much closer to the kind of view that someone like Quine was defending. And you know, I mean, I think I'm clearly right about this, and I think it's one of those cases where I really think their interpretation is untenable, and I think it's very clear. But the reason why they really wanted to add this interpretation is that, again, they came up with this stuff during the heyday of the empiricist movement, and it was kind of like a dogma that this was possible, and so they just didn't see the problems because of that. But it doesn't mean the problems don't exist.
Are there still people defending this perspective? Like who would you convince?
I don't know. I mean, you know, I think for the most part, people have stopped caring. My impression is that people have stopped caring about this topic. They just they cite the stuff, and they talk about the classical interpretation in passing, but they don't pose to consider whether this is even tenable. And it's yeah, I don't think it's really a question that people, you know, they sort of assume, you know, this has been settled, and so this is not really, as far as I can tell anyway, a question that interests a lot of people. But I personally, I do think it's interesting to think about, because it's like this. I think it's important to run it. It's one small part of the answer to the question, the more general question of, you know, the Wigner unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in science. And, you know, and so that's a fascinating question, I think. And this is just one small part of so I think it's important to get it right. Even though, again, it's just a small part of it. So anyway, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. In describing your dissertation to me, I could see a little enthusiasm lighting up your face. Are you still interested in academia and continuing as a philosopher?
So no, I mean, I am still interested in philosophy, and I guess, you know, so but I'm not interested in pursuing an academic career anymore, which is part of the reason why I still have defended. I guess it's hard to find the motivation to. I have to make revision from those two last chapters, and especially the second one. It's hard to find the motivation. Also, I constantly get into other projects, which appeal to me more. In part because I don't want to pursue a career in academia. I mean, I should do it anyway at some point still, but and so yeah, no, I'm not really interested in pursuing a career in academia. So I was almost done, or so I thought, with the dissertation. I went back to France to work in a startup for a while, which was kind of finance, but more about helping people get personalized financial advice, you know, and something which is not very, doesn't really exist in France at the moment. It exists, but it's not very common, even though a lot of people could benefit from it. But it's not part of the culture, I guess. And so the main goal of the startup was to help develop that. That was interesting, but I guess I left after a while, in part because the initial strategy didn't work, but we changed the strategy, and so there wasn't really any role for me in the new strategy after this. And in part because I was more interested in more technical stuff. I was, you know, doing data science type of things, which, especially after the change of strategy, was not really something that we needed to do. And then, you know, during all this time, you know, starting from when I was in Ithaca at Cornell, I was writing on the side, you know, on a blog, just on my spare time about various topics. And I got on Twitter. It's funny, I didn't think, I used to think that Twitter was I couldn't understand the appeal of Twitter, because at the time it was one of the 40 characters, and I was to me, in my head, Twitter was just a place where dumb celebrities were having fights.
Yep.
And I got convinced to join it because I was dating at the time. I was dating a girl who was in communication. It's just you need to get on, because I had the blog already. You need to get on Twitter to promote the blog. And I was Twitter seemed dumb, but eventually she convinced me. So
I traveled the path as you because I had my blog first and I only used Twitter to advertise my blog. But then gradually you get sucked in because pretty much everybody is on Twitter. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I found that, I found that Twitter was great. I met so many like interesting people whose existence I wouldn't even have suspected were it not for Twitter. I mean, it can be, it's tricky. Like you have to find the right balance, which I'm not even saying I'm particularly good at finding, but where you can end up wasting a lot of time on Twitter, having like debates with stupid people or people arguing in bad faith, which really drives me nuts. Uh, but you can also get, I think my writing benefits a lot from the debates I have on Twitter, because if you know who to argue with, which this is the hard part, but if you do, then it's a great way of testing your argument, of like getting like objections you wouldn't necessarily have thought about, or getting like hint about like possible solutions to problems you're considering, getting like recommendations of papers, or like if you follow the right people, you will instantly know about all the new papers on the topics that interest you. It's like such a great way for conveying information. It's like it great in a number of ways. Like, of course, I'm aware of the drawbacks too. Painfully aware of them, but overall, I'd say it's been really good. And also, it got me like a lot of. It just like my Twitter just took off very rapidly, and so it got like a lot more of attention. So like, I guess my ex-girlfriend was right. Like it did prop the blog a lot. And so, so the thing started to be read like a lot more, I guess. And again, it wasn't part of a plan or anything. I never imagined that this thing would work that well, and that it would give me the opportunity that it did. But it did. And so I ended up, so I had this blog for a while. Then I was recruited by Richard and Anya, who I think you know. I mean, I've seen you guys talk, so I know you know each other. For CSPI, so I wrote a number of things for them. I still write for them. I have the series, we're probably going to talk about this, it's kind of like my interpretation of the origins of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So the first part was published already on CSPI, and like I'm working on finishing the second part. So this is like really huge, but in fact, I'm probably going to publish the second part in several installments because it's too big. And also the different parts are pretty self-contained, so that's very good. Anyway, so I was I've been like working for PSPI, and I created a Substack more recently. So I'm also writing. I'm writing like on that Substack where I wrote about a number of things. I guess one thing that also gave me like a lot of eyeballs, or the blog, a lot of eyes from my various writing. Is COVID. Like I wrote a lot about COVID, mostly criticizing some of the methods that were used in like the literature about particularly the effect of non-pharmaceutical interventions, which were just awful. Because, I guess I should have mentioned, I suppose it started because I was interested in scientific modeling in general from a more like philosophical perspective. And so I started to learn statistics on the side, because statistical modeling is like a pretty prominent example of like modeling in science, and it's useful and used in like a lot of different fields. And also because I always like was interested in social science, so I figured, if I want to understand that stuff, I need to learn more statistics. So I learned statistics on the side. And so when COVID came, I started reading those papers, and I was just like appalled by how terrible they were. And so I wrote about this. So I like one paper that was pretty popular that I wrote is about this paper, which I think to this day remains the most widely cited paper on the effect of non-pharmaceutical interventions during the pandemic, which was published in June 2020, I think. And so that claims that lockdown and other, mostly lockdowns, and other non-pharmaceutical intervention in Europe had saved in 11 or 13, I don't remember, European countries alone, like over 2 million people during the first wave. And so I read that paper and I was like, how could this thing even get published? It got published in Nature.
Yeah.
How could it even get published? It was just preposterous, like the way, because basically it just assumed a conclusion in a way, like they fitted a model that assumed that the only thing that could affect the rate of transmission was those government intervention. And then, concluded, that those interventions, because the thing, that were at a huge effect, with a huge impact, hence the 3 million lives saved because of them, thanks to them, etc. But this is just like a purely like mathematical consequence of the fact that incidence stopped rising long before anything like herd immunity was written. But it doesn't really tell you why, this happened. Of course, the model assumes that this is going to be because of government intervention. But if you look at countries that didn't do that, or places that didn't, like Sweden leading the first wave, the thing that really changed my view about this stuff, because going into the pandemic, I read about those serum, compartmental models, and I was like, okay, so we do need to. In retrospect, I think even that was a dumb argument, but like we do need to lock down because otherwise we're gonna get like health services are gonna be overwhelmed so fast because it's gonna keep climbing until we reach herd immunity, and like that was the basis of the argument. But after the first wave, I thought, I mean, in practice, this was more gradual than that, but starting from April, basically, even end of March, April, and then it took me until like the next fall until I was fully convinced that those models were like just bad. And in part because of Sweden, I was like, look, I mean, in Sweden, they had much lighter, not that they had no intervention, but they were in comparison to France, where I lived, it was almost nothing. And yet, incidence also stopped rising well before herd immunity was written. So, I mean, of course, there are other ways. I remember for a time I was like, okay, maybe the fatality rate of the disease is not as high as we thought, and that would be one explanation. And the prevalence of the infection was higher than we thought in Sweden. In fact, they did have reached herd immunity. And another possibility that in certain models where you introduce some complications in a basic serum model, you can get like a lower herd immunity. You can reach herd immunity at like a lower prevalence of infection. So, but eventually, I realized that no, it's just that the way in which those models model the spread is just wrong. And so there are various explanations. One possibility, for instance, is that the people like voluntary behavior. The behavioral response, even in the absence of any kind of government intervention, is such that it will be enough to drive the transmission rate down, even in the absence of government intervention. And I do think that there is something to that, and this was probably part of the explanation for why in Sweden it also didn't get all the way to herd immunity during the first wave. But in another paper, I argued, that if you look at the available evidence, it's not plausible that this is the only explanation, because there are various cases where if you look at the data we have, which admittedly is very imperfect about people's behavior, stuff like, mobility data, restaurant frequentation, that sort of thing. There are many cases where you don't see any obvious change in people's behavior, and yet, incidence starts falling all the same. And this is very puzzling. And so I was very annoyed by the fact that it's not as if I had like an explanation for why, this happened, but I was annoyed by the fact that nobody was bothered by that. There was a clear anomaly, in the data, and nobody is certainly not, the professional epidemic model. We're happy to publish like crap based on those like really simplistic models. Was really bothered by that and looking for explanation for that.
So if I could just comment a little bit based on my experience, many, many years as a scientist and having some somewhat broad interests, just including outside of physics. there are fields where things are messy. And so someone who's a little bit rigorous minded looking from the outside says, hey, you guys can't conclude anything. Right. And the dynamics I've found for those fields is that people self-select out. So if you're not satisfied, like let's suppose Philippe, I said like, hey, you know, the government of France is like determined you are going to become a biostatistician. You're going to focus on epidemiology. You might get very irritated because you might say like your counter argument might be like, I can't conclude anything from what I have available for me. Too messy. No one should have high confidence in the conclusions of any of these.
That's interesting.
Get me out of this field. Get me out. Right. And then, so the field becomes an accumulation of people who accept shoddy reasoning. They like their model. They like to publish the paper on their model, even though like maybe secretly they know it's not very reliable, or maybe they're just the type of person who doesn't question very much, right? So I find whole fields of academia like this. And I knew immediately when the pandemic started, because I had done a little tiny bit of work in epidemiology back when the SARS thing happened. And I just realized like there's so complicated that getting to really high confidence, high conviction predictions would be extremely hard. Like the thing you mentioned, like maybe people don't change the number of times they go to the restaurant, but maybe they're very careful, like covering their faces or doing something differently, the way they grab the handle of the bathroom door. You know, we're never going to have good models for exactly how this all works, right? So, but anyway, so the funny thing, like even like history, like I always argue with my wife about this. I think historians, having known a lot of historians, are people who are selected to be overconfident in what can be determined about the past from the kinds of sources that are available to historians. Whereas someone else like me might come along and say, like, we don't even really know who killed Kennedy. And you're telling me you knew what happened. You're telling me some really complicated thing about what happened in the 15th century in Germany. I don't even know who killed Kennedy, right? But the field is self-selected. So if you like that game, the game is to push your theory of what happened during COVID or your theory of what happened in the 15th century in Germany. You like that game. The other people that are more skeptical and careful self-selected out. They don't want to play that game with you. They're doing something else. And then so you end up with these communities where they're kind of a little bit impervious to someone like you. I mean, sure, you could easily come along and just grab the most, at any given moment during the COVID epidemic, you could grab the most prominent paper, the most influential paper, and just rip it to shreds, which probably you did, right? But then you got frustrated because nobody cared, right? The epidemiologists. Yeah. So sorry, I just had.
So yeah, it's interesting. This is very similar to how I think about science. You know, I think people have this idea of scientists as people who like, which is completely wrong. You know, people who are like working assumptions free, very free spirit and stuff like. But you know, I think this is complete. I think really, scientists are much more like plumbers than people realize. Basically, you go to grad school, you learn what I call a script. You learn a bunch of scripts. And those tell you how to write a paper. And there are a number of scripts. And what you do in grad school is that you learn a bunch of scripts. They will tell you how to write the different kinds of paper. And then if you want to have a career, all you have to do is like follow the script. And you churn out papers that full. And as long as they follow the script, you're going to get to publish them somewhere, and you will have a career.
Sorry to interrupt you, but the difference between fields is, I agree with your characterization, but the difference is that in some fields, if you're following the script and nothing much is happening, like you're going to get punched in the face. So in other words, if you're doing some experiment with superconductors and you say the wrong thing, or some other lab immediately shows that you're wrong, the incentives are different, and the ability of other people to check you is stronger. Whereas I could publish some very influential but ultimately pretty crappy epidemiology model, and it could get thousands of citations, but nobody can really push back on me because there isn't a clean way to test my paper, right? So
you're never gonna bump into reality in many fields, or in some fields you will bump into reality, and that will act as a check, on this kind of stuff. But but I think, the script thing is true of every field. It's just that in some field, you will bump into reality, and that will
right. I mean,
they'll provide a correction mechanism.
But some of these scripts actually work. So in other words, like if I say, genotype all these people, then do this machine learning process, then publish this predictor, and then we'll take the predictor to Australia and it works, right? So some of these scripts actually work, some of the scripts don't work.
Yeah.
And the question,
but the point we're making is that in many fields we have no way to know whether it works, and that's why it gets the
problem.
And so
for myself, like when I started graduate school, I thought I was originally intending to do string theory. But as I learned more about string theory, I realized this is not going to be testable in my lifetime. So in a way, it's almost kind of not, it's sort of borderline not physics, because unlike other areas of physics, it's not very falsifiable, at least in my lifetime. So I said, I'm not going to work on string theory. But we have a luxury in physics of being able to select between, things that are readily testable and things which, okay, maybe in 20 years, this will be testable, maybe never. But in other fields, it could be just never for everything, right? So
yes, so I have a pretty, well, I guess I'll come to it. Let me finish on the plumber thing. I think, people, it's a lot more like learning a trade than people realize, I guess, is the point I'm making. And so, but in many fields, and so this actually relates to the thing you were just talking about, is that in many fields, we have no way of knowing that following the script is actually truth conducive, precisely because we don't have this response from reality. Like you can't check a lot of the stuff, like even stuff where it looks like, like recently there was those economists who were doing like a victory lap, claiming that they had got because they had written this paper showing that, the economic effect on Germany of the Russian gas cutoff was going to be fairly small. And so recently they were, and I guess, if you compare what they're saying to what some people in the industrial union and trade unions were saying, then sure, I guess they're right to do a victory lap. But that's because what those people are saying was insane. They're saying there's going to be a drop in output of like 10%. Okay. Nobody's serious, believe it. I mean, I get what they're annoying, because it's true that in the press in Germany and stuff, you had those apocalyptic predictions. So in a sense, it would be wrong for me to say, even though I do think it's true that nobody's serious believes that. They were featured prominently in the press and they were part of the public debate. So, okay, fair enough. But, but nevertheless, beyond that, we don't even know what the effect actually was. They're talking as if we could measure the effects on output of the Russian gas cutoff. And so we could check this measured result against their predictions that they made, before the cutoff. But we can't measure it, because it's essentially a counterfactual claim, so you just can't, like you can look at the forecast, the difference between the actual growth and the one that was forecast before the cutoff by various forecasters like the IMF or whatever. But even that, doesn't measure the actual effect, because there could be a number of reasons why the forecast was off beside the Russian cutoff. I mean, it's not as if like economic forecasts were known for being particularly accurate all the time, So, this is a thing where you don't have this kind of like, it's like you said, it's like you're like, testing a superconductor. It's not going to work. You're going to be able to see it in a fairly straightforward way. I mean, I'm sure there's simplification that in many cases it's not as straightforward, but surely, it's a matter of degree, but like it's going to be much more straightforward. Like in this case, you can't escape that even to estimate the actual impact, this is going to be model based and it's going to be crucially hinging on the various assumptions you make in the model. But why should I trust the model? And you go back to square one. So, and it's not just that in many cases, we don't have any good reason to believe that following the script is actually truth conducive. It's worse than that, because in many cases, we actually have good reason to think that it's not truth conducive.
Yes. Yeah.
But people don't care, because and it's exactly what you were talking about earlier. And so in the case of epidemic modeling, that was one of those cases where I was like, look, you have this explanation, and there are clear anomalies in the data, like this stuff about, even if we assume that it's like voluntary behavior, they explain the data we have on this, which again, admittedly is like very imperfect. In many, many cases, you see like, changes in the transmission rate that don't seem to be associated with any kind of behavioral change in one direction or another. And so but no, nobody cares, So one of the things I did is, I was really bothered by this. I was like, okay, this is really weird, and I wanted to understand it. And so I figured, okay, I think you're right. I think ultimately, we can't know because it's just too messy. And we also the data we have is too poor and it's just too complicated. And so, if I'd been, one thing I explain all the time that the incentives are fucked because if you're a smart enough person to understand those methodological issues, and if you're intellectually honest, and a journalist or some government official asks you to say, what's going to happen if I do this? What's going to happen if I do this? If I do that? The honest answer should be, I don't know. But of course, if you do say that, they're not going to, if you're a journalist, they're not going to invite you again. If they're a government official, they're going to find someone who will answer the question, even though he won't know any more than you. In fact, chances are, if he doesn't realize that he's not in a position to know, he knows less than you, because at least I know that I'm not in a position to know, and apparently he doesn't even know that. So
almost every human endeavor, the incentive is toward being overconfident.
Yeah.
Right.
So
if you say, no, the journalist is not going to quote you, you're not going to become famous guy in your field, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Those fields where if you are overconfident, someone punches you in the face right away. Those are the only fields where the incentives are flipped. Everywhere else, the incentive is to be somewhat overconfident in what you say.
So that was the case over there, and in the case of, but even if you're not in a position to say what's going on, I think you should at least. So that's what I try to do: is that acknowledge the anomaly or anomalies, and B, try to come up with at least some possible explanation, even if you will never be in a position to verify that those are the actual explanations. So one hypothesis I proposed, for instance, was that so those models that people are using, they assume that human populations are what they call homogeneous mixing, what essentially means that they model human population in which the virus spreads as an ideal gas in physics, like a bunch of molecules that randomly bump into each other, and that's how the virus spreads. Well, of course, this is a completely unrealistic way of modeling the way people interact with each other, and those interactions that give rise to viral transmission. And in reality, people interact, people's interactions form a network.
Yep.
And so it's not random. And so what I did is look, what's going to happen, what I showed that if you model the spread of the virus on a network, then you can see that depending on the topology of the network, the epidemic behavior can be very different.
Absolutely.
And so if you have something that's called community structure, where basically in the overall network, you have some parts of the network that are internally very well connected, but those parts are very poorly connected to each other. What can happen is that the virus is going to feed, is going to be one of those parts of the network that are, very well, like community, is going to be very well internally connected, but poorly connected to each other, is going to be seeded by the virus. The virus is going to spread easily in that part of the network because it's very well internally connected. Herd immunity is going to be reached locally, and then it's going to die down. And then what's going to happen is that you have a certain probability, which is fairly low, that it's going to jump to another community, in which case, it will rise again, or it will just die down because in that part of the network, herd immunity will be reached. And so this is one possible explanation for why you had this cyclical behavior, when including in many cases, because there were cases where behavior could be measured as changing, but there were many cases where it wasn't, and yet still had this kind of behavior too. So that's one possible explanation. And then what I did is that I simulated fake epidemic, assuming that the virus was in fact spreading on this type of network. And I showed, and then what I did is so I had fake data based on this fake epidemic of a virus that spread on this type of network. And then I did, okay, what happens if we use the econometric techniques that people are using, in fact, to study the effect of virus government interventions on the spread of the virus on those data. And what I show is that because implicitly those econometric techniques, so that's an interesting thing where people those assumptions are almost always left implicit. But if you think hard enough about it, you see that for those methods to recover the causal effect of those interventions, you have to assume that the virus spreads on a homogeneous mixing population. And okay, if the network has a topology such that there isn't like this community structure, it's going to be a good enough approximation, even though it's not homogeneous, really homogeneous mixing. It's not going to bias your estimates of the causal effect of those interventions too poorly. But when you run those methods on those fake data that are obtained by running an epidemic on a network that has a structure, what you see is that then you get estimates of the causal effect of those interventions that are really, really, really badly biased.
Yeah.
And so, again, but we don't know what the topology of the network is. So, if you're intellectually honest, you have to say, okay, I mean, you can use those techniques if you want, but, you don't, the validity of the conclusions you get rests on the assumption that the network on which the virus is actually spreading has a certain topology, and we don't know that it has it, and so, that's just, and of course, in a sense, it's a negative result so it's the kind of thing that, as you were saying too earlier, like nobody at least wants to hear, because it's kind of like you're ruining the party and saying, yeah, you can't know for sure.
It takes a very mature and on average high G subfield where people appreciate negative results. So in math, you could prove a no-go theorem, like it's impossible to prove this, or like as you're familiar with from logic. Or in physics, oftentimes if you show that there's no way to do better than this particular bound in characterizing something through this experimental technique, people actually appreciate it because they understand like it's actually valuable for reasoning. But in most fields, look, just to be honest, in biology, not a single person understands this stuff, basically. So you won't get credit for negative results in almost all fields, actually. Oh, there's only a few exceptions.
So I have like this taxonomy of scientists. If you look at, based on my experience of like with epidemiologists, so I have like this I distinguish like three classes of epidemiologists, and this is based on like what I've observed, like the kind of paper they write, the kind of emails I've received, because I did get like a lot of emails from various people who, will tell me things by email that they wouldn't say publicly often. And also the response to the stuff I write. I wrote about this, exactly like how receptive or non-receptive they were to those kind of like negative results. They were. And so I think you have one part of those people who are just dumb. Like they don't even understand. They don't understand, the limitation of those methods because they're literally not intellectually equipped to understand it. I mean, I've had like surreal conversations. There is this woman. So to be fair, she's not an epidemic model. She's an epidemiologist, but as you know, it's like this huge field where people do completely different things. And she doesn't. I don't think she works. I hope anyway that she doesn't work on anything that's like math intensive. But I had this conversation where she could not understand like high school level math. I know it sounds like I'm cheating you or something. I'm exaggerating, but no.
I'm not. I'm not surprised. I've had these experiences myself.
I assure you it's true. And so, okay, so you have those people, but this woman was invited constantly on by television channel in France, etc. And she would opine about this stuff and I confidently say stuff that she was in no position to say. It's crazy, but like, so, I mean, I didn't have a very high...
She's the winner. She's on TV. People,
I mean, she's literally the winner. She actually got a gold medal from our institution for her work. I kid you not. It's like she works at the most prestigious French biomedical research institution, the INSERM, and she got
honestly, Philippe, but some people are praying for the arrival of AI because the AI might not be this dumb. The AI may be able to read all these papers during the epidemic and then advise the president. Actually, we know very little. We cannot actually extrapolate confidently.
Yeah, you use a very simple heuristic and don't trust anyone else like those. But so you have one class of people. They're just dumb, to be honest. I'm sorry, but there is no other way to put it. They literally don't understand the limitations of their method. They just apply them mechanically like a bunch of automats, and they don't understand the conditions under which those will be reliable and the conditions under which they won't be. Then you have a second class, which are people who are smart. So the problem here is not that they're stupid, but they're not, in part because the incentives are bad, and in part because of their character, I guess. They're not very inclined toward those like methodological questions. So they will write papers, and they will understand the limitations of their method at a very high level of abstraction. They will write the limitation section of their paper. They will say all the right things about it, etc. But they won't really internalize how deep the problem is, how seriously this undermines the reliability of their conclusion. They will just go through the motion of like writing this little section, stuff. And so, but they will never, in part because it's not in their character, but in part also because they're not incentivized to do it. Like you don't need to do this to get stuff published. And in fact, if you do, you're going to waste time, and get less stuff published. And you're going to get scooped with your fake result by another person who's going to publish the fake result before you. So because of that, they just won't really think very deeply about those issues. And because they won't think very deeply about those issues, the result will be that they won't have a very deep understanding of how serious the problem is. And then you have the third class of people who are both smart and inclined to think deeply about those issues and to care about them, despite the bad incentives. And those people will understand exactly how fake all this stuff is, how unreliable it is. But, they have only two possibilities, two possible choices here. A, they exit the field, which is what you were talking about earlier, with the number of people that will tend to select out. And yeah, I think you're right. Often this is what happens. But I think in other cases, they won't leave because, look, now they're in the field. They have their whole life is organized around this. So they will just like go through the motion. But at least, unlike the people in the second class, and especially people in the first, they will understand, but it's kind of like it must be bad for them psychologically, I guess, like because they understand what they do is like just kind of fake in that sense, but they will, so I got those emails from people who would like send me emails, say, yeah, I'm in the field and like, yeah, I know this is fake, but what are you going to do? And they're right. What are you going to do? It's just like, nobody is going to be interested. You're not going to get, your career is not going to get advanced by publishing this sort of like negative result, because this is not, it doesn't follow any of the script. And, if it doesn't follow one of the script, you don't get the stuff published.
Yeah, I think your categorization is 100% accurate. And there are people who are both smart and epistemically careful, but they tend to be a minority in the field, in most fields, because incentives are against them succeeding. And for them, just think how frustrating it is to spend 30 years in a field where you realize the field is completely noise dominated like this. And you're just like gradually eking out some tiny results that you can actually believe in out of all this crazy activity that goes like this, right? There's that's sort of the sad story, I think, in a lot of fields, whether it's psychology or climate science or epidemiology. That breakup into three categories is completely accurate.
So yeah, so that's kind of what I did a lot of. So I was already, those are ideas that at one level or another already had before the pandemic, but the pandemic really radicalized me in that sense. Like, because and I guess one reason is that in the case of the pandemic, those results were also had like some direct, in many cases, some direct like impact on public policy. Most of the time, this stuff, it's not that it has no impact, although often it doesn't have any. But even when it does have an impact, it's much more indirect. It's like very downstream of the actual research, and it's more like the accumulation of like similar results that changes the culture of people, in public policy and like affect the actual policies that are implemented. But then you get all the messy stuff of like democratic or non-democratic, as the case may be, decision making that will also like affect policy often much more than this stuff. But in this case, like you could see people would like I would get, in France we got some pretty strong like measures, for months, for like 6 months, more than 6 months, I was, there was a curfew in place, which, it's a curfew, it's not some anodyne thing. It's like the type of things we do during wars, where after 6 p.m., I would be like considered a criminal and be fined if I left my home and everything was closed. I couldn't do like several times I forgot to buy my groceries in time. And then I was like, I didn't keep the time, and I was like, fuck, it's 6, I have nothing to eat because it's just like, so you could order food, because at least after the first lockdown, the delivery service still worked, but just like, it was a crazy thing. And then I had people who would go on TV, scientists who would do like press conferences with the government saying, oh, our models showed that the curfew has saved, X number of lives. And I was like, are you serious? Like, your model is total crap, Like anyone who understand, like the most basic statistics, can tell that this doesn't show anything. But you're using this. Look, I'm not even saying, look, if you want to defend the curfew on like prudential grounds or whatever, I think it was crazy at this point, but, okay, at least, we can agree to disagree on that. But like, that's not what they were saying. They were pretending that those completely garbage methods, like scientifically demonstrated, whatever that meant, that, this was effective and was saving like thousands and thousands of lives. And this is just like, this is either like total incompetence or dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty. In that case, I actually think it was intellectual dishonesty because the woman I have in mind is a different epidemiologist, and this one does epidemic modeling. And I've read some old papers he wrote like 15 years ago that tells me that she understands those complications, So it's just, but yeah, of course. But then she'd get to be on TV, to give a press conference, to get the sanction of the government, to get money for her lab, et cetera, just playing the game. But the game is crap. And so I guess, yeah, I already had like most of those ideas about, the problems of social science before. But this truly radicalized me, like in a way, that previous like issues, had not. So, and to continue with what I'm up to, now I'm working more. So, COVID, as I said during our pre-recording like discussions, I've kind of like put this behind me because I spent too much time talking about it. I'm still, as I was telling you too, I'm still really interested in those like meta science issues. This is not like COVID specific. COVID was just like, for the reasons I just outlined, a particularly striking example of the kind of damage that this stuff can do. But those are issues that, will stay with us even though that COVID is gone.
Wait till you get into climate modeling or some other things.
No, I never did that, but
don't do it. Don't look too carefully.
So, yeah, so those issues are still interesting to me, and also because they're like, they're just related to like, they're connected to really interesting epistemological issues too. I think like the next thing I'm gonna do, I'm getting more into like back into macroeconomics. I'm really more interested into like the, So, recently there was this famous like Nobel Prize economist called Deaton. I forgot his first name. Angus Deaton, who published this paper that was very, where like he criticized, the profession of economics. He got a lot of shit from people. And I think some of his arguments are just like not convincing. But I think he makes a point that it's true, and nobody's like, wants to admit that it's true, or like he gets a lot of shit, but I haven't seen a single person say, by the way, this is actually a good point. Even though some people have made this point in the past, it's not a novel point. The point he makes is that, we've moved recently. There's been with this thing that the economists call the credibility revolution, and which they're very proud of. And it's basically what this describes as the shift to like quasi-experimental methods to estimate the causal effects of various things in a way that's like where you have like more credible identification than with like the type of structural model that they used to in the heydays of like the Coles Commission, that type of stuff. And it's true, that you have like more credible identification, although I think often even those methods have their own problems that are kind of like underestimated, but okay, certainly more credible than like the previous method in general. But the point he says, the point he makes, which I think has not been acknowledged enough, is that those methods focus the attention of the profession on local effects at the expense of looking at more what he calls like slow-acting mechanism.
Yes.
That can be really important, but that will like act with a lag and over like a very long period of time. And those methods are not going to tell you anything about it. And there are some arguments that some people make, like Andres coined the term like the credibility revolution, I think, made this argument that, yeah, you can use the method, you can still get generalized based on those methods by multiplying the studies that use those methods in different settings. But I don't think that you can really generalize a lot from this. And you need theory. The problem is that you need theory to be able to support the kind of policy relevant counterfactual that people are really interested in. Because ultimately that's what we care about, economists, that we want to be able to know what would happen if we did this or if we did that, And you need a theory, but the problem is that to empirically validate the theory, when you try, you will run into the same kind of identification problem that motivated the shift to the quasi-experimental method in the first place. So you get trapped basically because you have, on the one hand, if you want to have like the kind of like more general theory that can support the policy relevant counterfactual, you can't get credible identification to estimate causal effects. And on the other hand, if you in response to this fact, you shift to like those quasi-experimental methods, then you will more credibly identify, causation, and for like and be able to estimate the local causal effect. But this will leave out a lot of questions, which honestly are really more relevant or more interesting to most people than the ones that those can address. And so you get stuck, and and I thought it was a pity that, I mean, sure, there were some bad arguments in the short piece, in question, but I think, look, when someone makes like a good and important point, I think it's better to focus on the good and important points, rather than like pick at the bad examples, or the bad arguments he also made in the thing, like, but ultimately that. So that's one thing I want to explore more in the future. But at the moment, what I'm doing is something completely different. I've been writing a lot about the origins of the Russo-Ukrainian War. So when I was, studying political science, in that school I got, for, I specialized, in international relations. So I've been interested in that stuff for a while. And so I've been particularly interested in post-Cold War Western-Russian relations for a while. And so I think, this is another, it's funny, you have, it's very different, of course, from like epidemiology or economics or sociology. It's more like history and political science, the non-quantitative type. But I also think that, like there too, there is this narrative that I think is very simplistic so I think basically the standard narrative is that what I call like eternal Russian essence theory, where, the Russians have always been bad and like to invade their neighbors and it's in their DNA. And so, that's just like their natural expansionism, and that's what explains everything. And I think this is wrong. It's not to say that there aren't like strong imperialist undercurrent in Russia, because there definitely is. But it's just like the real history is more complicated than that. And basically, I think that the West in general and the US in particular have had very stupid policies toward Russia in the post-Cold War era. And I think we wasted an opportunity. I don't think, it's plausible that everything would have gone perfectly well between Russia and the West, and we would have been like best friends forever and that sort of thing. That's not what I'm saying, but I thought that if we had been smarter about it, and if they'd been smarter about it, but it's a two-way street, and we only focus on what they did wrong and never look at what we did wrong. we could have reached a modus vivendi that would have avoided this total catastrophe that is going, because it's terrible. Honestly, this thing is like, obviously the worst affected, of course, is Ukraine, which is going to get completely wrecked. I mean, I think at this point it's already certain that no matter what happens next, they will not recover demographically for the rest of the century, at least. So it's a complete disaster for them. It's a disaster for Russia, which is becoming like a weirder and weirder place. Such a tragedy. I mean, for both of those places have such like huge pools of like human capital potentially, at least, that, you know, not just them, but the rest of the world could benefit from. And it just goes to waste because of the stupid shit. And it's terrible for the rest of the world too. I mean, for Europe, we're going to suffer economically a lot from it. I mean, I know there's like this magical thinking that for some reason, now that we don't get the Russian gas, it's going to be wonderful for us, even better. I don't know exactly what. You know, it's funny. You have those people who correctly, I think, point out that, say, tariff will like really damage the economic well-being on average. So then I understand there are like distributional issues that are too often like neglected, even though they're important, but, you know, on the whole, they're going to damage the welfare of people, and like, or actually, it doesn't even matter if it's true. I mean, I do think it's true, but what matters is that those people are the ones who constantly make this point about tariffs. And then, you know, even though the cause is different, the mechanism is going to be like very similar, or the effect that is going to be similar to the Russian cutoff. We had like relatively cheap, you know, energy source that now we're going to have to pay for, and it's going to last for several years because we're going to have to rely on LNG, and, you know, it's a different production, more costly production function basically. And so it's going to be, it's like a permanent supply shock. It's going to hurt Europe a lot. I mean, it already has hurt us a lot, although as I was like, I don't know, I think that was before we recorded, like or maybe not, you know, like it's hard to estimate exactly how costly it's going to be, but there is no question that it's going to be very costly. We're supposed to be, basically because people are happy that we're cutting off Russia, you know, we're cutting our relations with Russia politically. They want to ignore the economy because they pretend it doesn't exist, but it's just like, even by their own assumptions, you know, this is going to be large. And even for the US, because look, there is this common argument that the US is the only one that benefits from this, and China maybe. China, it may actually be true that they benefit from this, although even that is debatable in my opinion. But the US, I mean, sure, they get to sell LNG to Europe. I mean, and they get to sell weapons. But, you know, in the total, like, US GDP, this is very small. Whereas the effect it's going to have, I mean, Russia, at the end of the day, is still the only country on earth that can literally wipe the US off the face of the map. There is not even China, although unfortunately soon it will be the case, I think, but because they're going to build up their nuclear arsenal. But still, right now, it's still the only country that can do that. And there was this fairly elaborate system of like arms control, especially nuclear arms control, that had been put in place at the end of the Cold War, or starting with the détente, and then, you know, even more so under Gorbachev and early Yeltsin, that like started to unravel, in fact, before that, and largely because of the US. So that's another thing, you know, that's part of this whole thing that we don't consider, you know, in how we got to this point, where, you know, this whole apparatus, this arms control system, the ones who started to dismantle it was not the Russian, if only because, you know, arguably they benefited most from it because they were poor, and so it's harder for them to maintain like a large nuclear arsenal than it is for the US. And the US, in fact, in parts of that region, started to dismantle it after the end of the Cold War, and now this war is going to completely destroy it. I don't think there was going to be much left of it. Yeah.
There's an effective sort of expected utility calculation you can do where you say, well, the amount of trust now between the US and Russia is at an all-time is very low, certainly lower than if we hadn't had this conflict. And as you say, we're dismantling all these safeguards against nuclear.
Yeah. I mean, so
I just to finish, if you just say like it increased by a few percent, the possibility of the U.S. being wiped off the face of the earth. Well, of course, we would wipe Russia out too, but still very terrible outcome. Hundreds of millions of people. That totally outweighs anything that could have happened pro or positive or negative in Ukraine, right? So if you take that perspective, it just everything is just stupid, right? We increased the existential risk from nuclear weapons over a very tiny little border region, right? That we could have just given.
And it's worse than that, because it's not just that the bilateral arms control apparatus between the US and Russia is being destroyed by it. Like I said, it had already been started to be dismantled before that. But no, it's we're basically finishing the job with this conflict. But the problem is that, look, this bilateral system, we could have hoped if it had stayed in place, and even if it had been, we can dream, reinforced, then I think it would have been a good basis to be turned into a multilateral system that would have included China. Prevents, but now it means that the prospect of this get even more remote.
Yes.
So, is the U.S. really benefited because it's selling like a few $1 billion worth of LNG and weapons to Europe thanks to this war? I mean, I find that ridiculous. I'm willing to listen to an argument that, this couldn't be avoided, although I think it's false. But the idea that, this is a good thing for the U.S. ultimately, it's not something I find very serious. I also think that in the end, we're not going to win this. I mean, nobody's going to win this, but I think that, look, the argument that the proponents of like restraints before the war, I still think that ultimately it will be proven right, even though it will have proven much more complicated than anticipated, in the sense the argument was basically, look, the Russians care more about Ukraine than we do. So if we go to a clash, we will get tired of it and we'll give up before they do. Ukraine will get wrecked, and we won't, sure, we'll impose a high cost on Russia, but again, it also imposed a high cost on us. So what's the point? So, it was dumb. I think we should have done more to try to prevent a conflict in the first place, because once we get into a conflict, it's just not plausible that we're going to win this in any meaningful sense. In fact, in any meaningful sense, I don't think anyone is going to win this. I think it's going to be a disaster for Russia too. And for what? I mean, they're going to get say they end up having like the 4 oblasts that they officially annexed in totality. They are able to conquer the rest of them. I don't even think it's obvious they'll get that, but it's possible. I mean, most productive people on those territories will have left by then. Everything will be destroyed. So it will cost them a shitload of resources to rebuild that stuff, and rebuild it for nobody, because there won't be anybody left except like low productivity people who will and then, they will get the sanctions because we're not going to remove them, because now it's become a moral issue. People they don't think of this in like anything like utilitarian terms. They don't see the sanctions, for instance, as like a tool, something that can be lifted to get Ukraine better terms for Ukraine, for instance, which is, I think, how we should think about them. But I don't at all think that this is how most people think about them, and I don't think how they're going to get used. I think if you try to limit them now, you're going to have like a whole concert of people telling you, oh, you're rewarding aggression, blah, blah, blah. It won't even matter that it could get better terms for Ukraine. It doesn't matter, because this sees this in moral terms. It's about punishing Russia. It did something wrong, we need to punish it. It doesn't matter that, I could hear someone say, okay, actually, this would not really help Ukraine get better terms. I think it's wrong, but, we can discuss certainly to what extent it would help. I think it depends on a lot of other things. So it's a complicated question. But it doesn't matter. I don't think people think of those sanctions in those ways. They think of them like in very, I say purely moral terms, but like I don't think this is really moral. I mean moral in a very narrow and short-sighted sense, So I think this thing is going to be a disaster in every possible way, and again, my view is that it was not unavoidable. It was something that could have been avoided if we had been smarter after the Cold War. And so this project that I'm working on at the moment is like, it's basically a whole history of post-Cold War Russia-West relation and my interpretation of how we got to that point, to the point where this war was even possible and even happening. And I go back to the end of the Cold War. So I go back to the end of the negotiations on like the unification of Germany, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all the way to the eve of the war, basically. And
can I ask you some quick questions where I'll throw out a hypothesis and then you tell me high conviction, medium conviction, high conviction it's not true. So something like that. Just you tell me whether you think it's true or not and how confident you are. So Maidan was to some extent a U.S. effort in order to weaponize Ukraine against Russia.
I don't think that's true for the most part. What I think is true is that I think Maidan happened for pretty much purely domestic reasons in Ukraine. But then what I think happened is that once it started, then the U.S. I mean, some people, the U.S. No state is like states are not like unitary agents. Like you have various sections, and I think some people within the U.S. national security apparatus saw that as an opportunity to weaken Russia, but this is complicated. This is mixed with their ideas about like promoting democracy, and I don't think in their mind they really make the difference very often. But it doesn't mean that conceptually those are not two different things. And there has been like going back to like the grand chessboard type of argument. People understand both in Russia and the U.S. the importance of Ukraine, and so this was certainly at least in the back of the mind of some people. And so I don't think Maidan was caused by anything the U.S. did, except like in very indirect ways. It contributed in very indirect ways. It found some NGOs and stuff, in Ukraine that helped the opposition organize and get this thing started. But like, I think people in general overestimate how easy it is to influence the internal development of like large countries. And so I'm not saying this stuff has no effect whatsoever. I think it was more. I think the U.S. was more important in the Orange Revolution than Maidan, but because in that case, I think the recount and everything, those NGOs were more important. In the case of Maidan, I think this stuff was like organic, and then after it already happened, then the U.S. hatched on this and made things work. But that's a different claim. That's a different claim from saying that I don't think they like orchestrated it, is what I mean.
Okay. I don't want to push you down this rabbit hole, but just in case you've done some research on this, I would like to hear your thoughts on it. The snipers that were operating in Maidan, who were they working for?
So I haven't read the most recent stuff. And, especially I know there's been like the trial, has concluded. So you have like more evidence and stuff. So I haven't read the more recent stuff. I'm still where we were like a few years ago because I've been too busy like working on doing the rest of the research for like older stuff. But I'm going to get to this by the time I get to the part where I discuss Maidan. But based on where we were a few years ago, I do think that actually, I'm not sure what happened, but I think there is a non-negligible probability that it was actually, at least in parts, that at least some of the shooting was by far-right groups were opposed to the government and not the government itself. So it's. But like I said, I haven't read like the most recent stuff. But I do think there is a lot. Like going back a few years ago, so without even taking into account the most recent stuff, there's just a lot of stuff that's probably that people like want to ignore. But look, you know what? It's funny. One of the reasons I think that there is a serious probability that something like is at least partly true, this theory, is that what's their name?
Bellingcat?
Yeah, Bellingcat. Is that Bellingcat never did a debunking of the thing.
of course.
And look, I mean, I think that to me that's just like, I mean, I'm not saying that's even the main thing, you know, like, but I'm just saying I find that interesting that in there, yeah. So I think, you know, look, I mean, Yanukovych was really a bad guy and was, but here too, you know, the standard narrative is too simplistic. You know, people say Yanukovych was pro-Russia and they have this idea that he was fully aligned with Russia, but you know, that's just false. Yanukovych was pro-Yanukovych, first of all, and he actually, in fact, the problem. You know, I have this view that if Yanukovych had signed the association agreement at the end of 2013, none of that would have happened. The Russians would have been really pissed. They would have taken sanction and everything, but none of that would have happened. The problem is that Yanukovych tried to play both sides because it was in his interest, at least if you're short-sighted enough as he was, looked like it was in his interest, and then got pressured a lot by Russia. And the EU was also really stupid in that whole business. You know, they tried to play the geopolitical game like a bunch of bureaucrats. And so, of course, they lost. But, you know, so he was violating the constitution, you know, like he did all sorts of illegal stuff. He was gradually turning Ukraine into this like weird authoritarian state. I'm not denying any of that, but it's still the case that, you know, people have this idea of Maidan. Forget about the sniper thing. You know, I don't think it really matters to what I'm about to say here, which is the most important part of the whole story. Is that, look, people present Maidan as this kind of like revolution where, you know, the whole Ukrainian people, you know, overthrew this like authoritarian leader, et cetera, you know, and then like for democracy and blah, blah, blah. But if you look at polls at the time, you know, and if you look at the sequence, the political sequence that led to his overthrow, what happened really is that there was one side, it was a popular movement, but it was like one side, one half of the country that was opposed to another half of the country, but the half of the country that was opposed to Yanukovych was concentrated in Kiev. So it was disproportionately representing Kiev, and so they were able to overthrow him. They didn't overthrow him, you know, in anything like a regular way. I mean, this was a violent overthrow of a democratically elected government. I don't say that, you know, I don't say democratically elected in the sense. I know the guy was himself violating the constitution and the law all the time. I agree that he was turning the country into like this weirdo, like authoritarian state. I don't say that as if, you know, Ukraine before Maidan was this kind of perfect democracy thing. I'm just saying none of this was regular. Both sides, you know, violated the constitution, and it didn't, you know, I mean, people say, yeah, he was impeached, you know, by a regular vote of the parliament. I mean, that's not true. They didn't have the requisite number of votes. If you look, you know, you have pictures of like Western government entity where you see members of parliament of the Rada, of the party of region, Yanukovych party, were like beaten up by the crowd on their way to the vote. And people are like, and they're like, oh, look, there was the vote of like 300 something to 0. And I'm like, I mean, the very fact that it was 0 on the other side should tell you something here. You're like, so, you know, my point is like, look, nobody is looking good in that story. But they present this as this kind of like fairy tale of, you know, like heroic democratic revolution. But no, it was like much more messy than this. And, you know, and it was like one half of the country that won basically using irregular means against another half who wasn't asked to do this, you know. And then I think, you know, well, I guess maybe if you want to keep the game going, maybe I should let you ask the next question.
I have more questions. So could the conflict been avoided at relatively low cost by some simple security guarantees given to Putin in, say, 2021 or 2022?
It depends on what you mean by could. I think it's hard to say at this point. So I think there is a serious possibility that if we had, you know, I'm not saying that it would have been necessary to like fully agree to the draft agreement that they published in December 2021. But I think that's the main thing in that draft agreement, in my opinion, the thing that they really cared about is like some kind of like treaty guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO.
Yes.
And it's hard to say for sure, of course, because we're not in those people's head and the ways of the Kremlin are impenetrable. And so, but it's very hard to know for sure. But I think there is a serious possibility that, it would have prevented the war.
Okay.
So in that sense of could, yes, maybe. I mean, I'm not saying we could have agreed. We would have had to agree to the whole package. I think if we had agreed to this, then we could have negotiated on the rest. It's at least there is a serious possibility, in my opinion, that this could have been done. But that's one sense of could. But then, so in a way, theoretically, we could have done that, and maybe it would have prevented the war. I think there is a much higher chance than most people think, in my opinion, that it would have prevented the war. But the problem is that this was not really like, in practice, this was not going to happen, because this idea that, the open door policy of NATO, by then had become completely solidified into a dogma, and there was just no way the West would ever agree to this. I don't think it was for any good reason. I think it's stupid. I think this whole dogma is completely stupid, because basically everybody knew in the West that as long as Russia would get so opposed, so upset at the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, it wasn't going to happen. We told them privately, and I think we were telling them the truth, the Russians, I mean. But because of this dogma, we had to pretend in public that it was a real possibility, and we had not to sign any kind of treaty that would have foreclosed that possibility. And so we basically forego possibility. You don't even have to say that it would have stopped the war for certain. Maybe it wouldn't have, but it was at least possible that it would have. And we had to not even try, because of this stupid dogma that in private people will tell you, yeah, I mean, of course.
But this dogma, it's funny, as an American, I would say even among our political class, even within our foreign policy elite, how many Americans really knew or cared about this open door policy of NATO? Most Americans actually would not. If the president had for some reason just decided, yeah, we're gonna publicly guarantee that they're not going to join NATO because we think Putin really might do something crazy, so we're going to do that. I don't think there's any particular interest group other than the people around Victoria Nuland or something in the U.S. who really care. So is it the Europeans that were forced? Who was enforcing?
I actually think that at least France and Germany would have been fine with this.
Yeah. So who was enforcing?
But they couldn't. It's the blob. I think you're right when you talk about Americans. You're right if you talk about regular people. Regular people in general just don't care about foreign policy in general.
Even generals and professors of IR and senators, I think
I think in the blob, this kind of like confluence of like think tankers, yes, national security officials, academics working on that stuff. I think there is a huge, very strong consensus in favor of that dogma. That dogma by that point really solidified. And so I don't think it was just like a handful of people around Victoria Nuland, etc. Although, of course, those people were like the core of this stuff. So I think that I agree. If Biden had done it, I'd said like, fuck it, I'm going to ignore all those people and do it. I think in the end, nothing dramatic would have happened.
Yeah, he would have for a few editorials against him in Foreign Affairs or something, right? Or a Wall Street. That's about it.
But the thing is that this is not how foreign policy decision-making works. Like the president is not, of course, in theory, is the ultimate decision maker.
Yeah.
But the way it works is like it goes through all those, yes, that's the way it works. It's funny, I want to write something on my Substack about this, like about people have this wrong idea about what a democracy is, because they have like the classical model of a democracy where policy is determined by the voters and the voters vote so as to maximize the satisfaction of their ideological preferences. This is completely wrong. It's not how people vote. People don't vote people are not ideologue. Like the vast majority of people don't even have a coherent and stable ideology. Really, I think a much better model is that people identify in certain social groups and they think, okay, how does a person who is a member of that group is supposed to vote? Again, they think, and, so that's why you have things like, in France, for instance, my favorite example of that phenomenon is like in France, you will talk to a grandmother and you will talk to her about immigration and you'll feel like you're talking to Himmler, it's like he will say the most racist shit about immigration that you can imagine. And then you're like, oh, so you're going to vote for Le Pen. And then she'll be genuinely horrified that you could make such a suggestion. Yes. Of course I won't vote for Le Pen. I'm not a fascist. I'm not a racist, blah, blah, blah. That she doesn't, she identifies a moderate, a person like that doesn't vote for someone who's labeled an extremist. So, if she voted to maximize the satisfaction of her preferences, she would vote for Le Pen. But that's not how people vote. And similarly, if you look at the decision making, in a way, I think it's wrong to think that of democracy as uniquely responsive to public opinion. Arguably, I think what differs more between democracies and authoritarian autocratic regimes is more how public opinion is shaped rather than how responsive public policy to public opinion. Yes. And if you look at, and in fact, arguably, democracies are perhaps less responsive, or at least governments in democracy are able to be less responsive on some topics to public opinion than in autocratic, because the magic of the election, it's a wonderful, the election, a competitive election, it's this incredible technology to provide legitimacy. It's like the new version of like the divine right, but it's much better.
Yes.
And so you didn't have like a French president
confers legitimacy magically like this.
Yeah. It's really magical. And so that's why a French president can run the country with like ratings at 25%. If you're Putin and your ratings are 25%, you're probably dead. Yeah, you're out in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, you're dead.
Macron won the election.
Yeah, exactly. But so and in particular in foreign policy, like in any regime, basically, you have people who are ruled, and you have people who rule. And democracy is no different, despite the, for the people, by the people. No, the best way to think about election and democracy is, I think, the purely procedural conception that Schumpeter defended, where it's like you should think of democracy as a mechanism to ensure the peaceful transition of power, the peaceful competition for political power between different elite groups. And election like fulfill that role. And in particular, and those elite groups are the ones who really determine policy. And the reason why the mass of voters can't, for the most part, is that they're too low information. They can't, so it's not that their opinions don't matter, because, the big issues, like they do create some constraints. If you raise taxes too much, this they can understand. But most of the issues, they don't have it. They're too low information to be like an effective check to ensure this responsiveness of policy. Yep. So in effect, what that means is policy is determined by this competition between different elite groups. And in foreign policy in particular, because this is something that everywhere, not just in the US, people care particularly not a lot about, then those elite groups are even more free to determine policy in ways that ignore public opinion. And so in the case of the US, I think that what people call the blob, which I think is a great concept, I think that this dogma, the open door policy for NATO, this dogma has had like a lot of stake up, and basically is very consensual in the blob. And so I think those people ultimately are the ones to determine foreign policy. I think that in that sense, it wasn't possible. And in fact, I will tell you something. Before I think it was in December 7th, 2021, that the Russians published this draft agreement. Before that, I thought it was impossible they would invade. Not impossible in the grand scheme of things. I wrote something in 2014. It was like making the argument for restraint I was talking about, that if we continue to push, eventually there will be a war and there will be nothing we can do because they care about Ukraine more than we do. But it's not as if I ever thought it was impossible in principle that Russia would invade Ukraine. But before December 17, I thought there was no chance it would happen now. And December 17 is the one time when I started to change my mind. I still, until the last moment, I thought it was more likely than not they wouldn't do it, to be honest. But December 17 really is the thing that that made me take it seriously, the possibility seriously for the first time. And the reason is that purely the Russians have to know about this dogma. They have to know that Biden is not going to do this. So if they publish this, and the fact that they do it publicly, because, when you do this stuff privately, you give yourself more room for like maneuver, negotiating some stuff, compromising it. But the fact that they do it, they make this stuff public, I was like, damn, I mean, I still think it's crazy that they wouldn't invade, but like it really looks like what they would do if they wanted to have some pretext, because they know very well that Biden is never going to accept that. Again, I'm not saying it's for good reason, but they had to know. I may be wrong about this. Maybe they didn't know it. I've heard a theory, which I've heard for someone who heard that from a fairly high level Russian official, and the theory is that after Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, the Russians interpreted this as some new era where they would be ready to like reject some very old dogma like the open door thing. And so maybe they really did think that he could do this. Honestly, I find that hard to believe, though. I think so at least at the time, that's what I thought. I remember thinking, it's still so crazy for them to invade it that like I don't believe they're going to do it. But now I don't know what to make of this thing, because it was like another anomaly. Like we're talking about an anomaly, and like it was a big anomaly for me, because I was like, I mean, why would they do this? Why would they publish this stuff? Why would they make it public and then risk losing face if, as was certain to happen, Biden refused to agree to this? Then they would lose face, and then what would they do? I mean, it seemed to me that I still didn't think they would do it, but I was like, that started to like make me take the hypothesis a lot more seriously. But so
I think sometimes when you watch Putin, I mean, obviously he's a professional, but sometimes I think some of his emotional or psychological feeling leaks out. And I do think he felt for many years the U.S. just was not taking them seriously, and ultimately just felt he had to do something very drastic in order to basically show the Americans that he was serious. So
Putin has this theory, which I think is basically correct, that if you look at the first, say, 8 years of his presidency, whereas the first year was Clinton, but then it was Bush, and people have forgotten, but Putin and Bush were really good friends. I mean, they were genuinely friendly. Like, it wasn't like just paying just for the job, etc. They really liked each other at a personal level. And Bush, he really wanted to get some, reach some modus vivendi with like Russia. And Putin believed that, and I think he was right to believe it because it was true. But what happened is that, and this was particularly clear, the thing that really made him like convince Putin of that is the anti-missile controversy, where Russia really like bent over backward to try to find a way that would both allow the US to have this anti-missile system, defense system, without, but like including Russia and the stuff, so that it would assuage, Russia's like security concern over this thing, which frankly were not unreasonable. They were, as always, exaggerated. They inflate the threat, but everybody does that. This is the result of like the anarchy of the international system. Like it makes people paranoid, and the Russians perhaps are particularly paranoid because of their history, etc. But like fundamentally, they're not that different. Like in the U.S. would not react kindly to that kind of stuff on the doorstep either. You can argue that it's irrational and stuff, and I agree to some extent it is, but it doesn't matter that everybody, at least every great power, is like this to a logic. So anyway, and Bush was really receptive to the proposals that the Russians put forward, and some other people in the administration were receptive to it. But then what happened is that between the times, between like Bush initial reaction, fairly positive reaction to the initial proposal, and the time when they made a counter proposal, it had gone through the blob basically, and they just destroyed us.
Yeah.
And Putin actually told, so this is like, you can read that in the Philippe Short's biography of Putin, which is really good. And Putin told to Bush, look, George, you and I, we want to reach an agreement. We want Russia and the US to make some kind of deal and everything. But the truth is that the the people who work for us, they don't, like, and he was saying on both sides, he was saying that about the Russians too. And he told Bush, you wouldn't believe the crazy proposals directed at the US that people put on my desk every day. And he says, and for you, I know it's the same for you. And that's what happened. And he was right, like it was. So he's convinced, basically, his conviction is that the US president doesn't make foreign policy. And he is right, like it's the blob, and the blob doesn't like Russia.
Yeah.
And I mean, fundamentally about this is right. I think the conclusions he drew from this were crazy and will harm Russia in the long run, let alone Ukraine and everybody else. But he was right about this, and anyway, that's his conviction. And given that this was his conviction, I find it really hard to believe that he thought that this December 17 draft agreement is something that Biden could ever agree to, because this is a conviction that he reached by the end of Bush's second term, and so I see no reason to think that he changed his mind in between it. In fact, I see every reason to think that this view was reinforced by what happened secondly. Like Syria in particular, or Libya in particular, and also Syria, but in Syria and they stopped it. But yes, I do think that something like this is the truth. But I also think there were some, basically my interpretation of the proximate causes of the war is that in 2014, after Maidan, he annexed Crimea without thinking a lot, out of a combination of fear and opportunism, fear that they may lose the Sebastopol base, naval base, with the new government, and opportunism because he thought, he had, after his re-election, his popularity was somewhat down. After the protest that was in 2011, apparently, the election was rigged and everything. He thought that he knew that this would be popular among a lot of people in Russia, and so that was like the bonus. So it was a combination of fear and opportunity in that sense, But he didn't think carefully about the long-term consequences of this. And then he lets weird people tear up shit in Donbass, and then realized, he figured. I think I'm conjecturing here. I do think this is the most consistent story based on the available evidence, which admittedly is limited. So I'm not saying I can be sure of this, but my interpretation is that he figured, okay, I'm going to let those people like Gherkin, Strelka, stir up shit in Donbass, and who knows, maybe the same thing will happen that happened or something similar in Crimea, and I can get this as a bonus. But then fairly quickly realized that it wasn't the same thing, because the population was very different in Donbass than it was in Crimea, where in Crimea, the support was much stronger support for Russia than at least for annexion by Russia than in Donbass, where, it was something, if you look at the polls, the last polls that were done before it became impossible to do polls over there, you had at best 1/3 of the population that was in favor of annexion by Russia, but not the rest. So that's why it didn't work out. And then he got scared. Like in April, he realized that this wasn't working, and that if it continued, he would endanger his relation with the West, and particularly with the Europeans to whom he was selling gas. And so he tried to stop it. But those people, it's very interesting to read the memoirs by those separatists over there. They were really upset by when he tried to stop their referendum for in the early May of 2014. They saw that as a betrayal, which in a way it was, except that Putin is not a Russian nationalist. It wasn't really one of theirs, despite what they might have thought. And so they went ahead anyway. And then, Putin was clearly wanting to stop this because he wanted to preserve his relation with the West. He was like, okay, I got Crimea. I'm going to just keep that, and that will be it. And I will keep my relationship with the West more or less intact. But then, the Ukrainian military eventually reacted, and they started to defeat the separatists. And then he got caught because it was like, it was hard for him politically, although he could have done it, and I think he should have done it, to let them be defeated by the Ukrainians. But he couldn't bring himself to do it, so he intervened, on the down low, and and then, tried to feed it. And then basically what happened after this is that the problem is that by taking out most of Donbass and Crimea, he took out the most pro-Russian regions of Ukraine, which completely changed the balance of political forces in Ukraine and made it inevitable that Ukraine, if left to its own devices, would go west, which is precisely what he didn't want to happen. But he hadn't thought about that when he annexed Crimea, because again, he did it like it was the spur of the moment kind of thing. Of course, they had military plan. That much is clear because of the way it happened. But everybody has like military plans for pretty much any possibility. That's not really surprising. And then for years, he tried to find a formula to square the circle, meaning preventing Ukraine from going west without having to go to war to do it, to like full-blown war, because again, the Russian army had already intervened in practice, but he never admitted, at the time he didn't admit it except for Crimea. But it didn't work because look, the Minsk agreement, the truth is that because people say Ukraine like violated them, it's true they violated them, but of course they violated them because the only reason they signed them like at gunpoint, basically. That's the only reason they signed them. So, and I think, to finish like my interpretation of the proximate causes of the war is I think that when Zelensky was elected on a platform that, in addition to like fighting corruption, was also to make peace with Russia, although he didn't tell how he was going to do it. And I don't think there was a realistic way for him to do this given the constraints he faced. And especially the nationalist pressure in Ukraine at the time. And so, but I think Putin, did hope that he would work out something with Zelensky, and that Zelensky was going to help him square that circle. And so, he gave him like a deal on gas soon after his election. You can tell that he was really hopeful that this would change the relationship and would help him square that circle. But then it didn't happen, like the Zelensky popularity crashed, especially with the pandemic. Of course, the fight against corruption didn't work out, like it never does. And so what he did is that the easiest way for him to get back up in the polls was to go after the low-hanging fruit was the anti-Russian voters. And so in the early 2021, he did this like anti-Russia U-turn. And then I think this is the moment where sometime after this, I'm not sure exactly when. Again, this is a lot of conjecture here. I'm not in the Kremlin's head, Putin's head or anybody else. But I think that sometimes after this, Putin basically realized that this was not going to work. Like if it's not working with Zelensky, it's not going to work with anyone else. So I won't be able to square the circle. So now I have to choose. Either I let what's left of Ukraine go west, or I go to war. And he decided to go to war. I think it was stupid and criminal, but I think that's the kind of like calculation he had in his mind at the time. And so, the stuff of the relations with the West and NATO and all that stuff, I think it mattered more before. It mattered more for 2014 and for what happened before. It explained how you could get to the point where you would have the kind of fear where you would do this. But after this, I think he got trapped into a trap of his own making. And he ended up with this dilemma that I just described, and he decided to go for the branch of the dilemma that was war, instead of like letting Ukraine go. And now everybody's going to get screwed. First of all, Ukraine, but, Russia too, us too. Like,
What is your interpretation of the negotiations in 2023 involving Naftali Bennett?
You mean 2022, right?
I'm sorry, March of 2022. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah. It's hard to tell. I'm really annoyed by the discourse on this because people on both sides, of course, in the West, especially the people who think that it could never have worked, etc., because that's by far the prevailing view. Talk with a great deal of certainty about this, but the problem is that because journalists have been strategically incurious on the topic, it's remarkable. How little investigation of this topic there has been, given how potentially important it is. And I think, my interpretation, that's why I say they've been strategically incurred. It's the same thing with the Nord Stream stuff, is that people don't look too much into it lest they find out something they don't want to find out.
Yeah.
And that was the most interesting piece about this was published only like a few days ago by the Wall Street Journal. So 2 years after those events, kind of crazy again when you think about it. And they described the deal. The problem is that according to all the accounts, including the most recent and the most thorough we have, which is the one by the Wall Street Journal, part of the deal that was floated by the Russians and that was at least in part agreed to by the Ukrainians included some kind of security guarantee by the West. And but because the Wall Street Journal didn't publish the actual non-paper, we don't have all the details about what this means, because it could be something like as empty as something so empty that it didn't actually commit Western countries to anything like definite, in which case, they might have agreed to it because there was no cost for them to do so. But suppose it's something as strong or similarly strong to like Article 5 in NATO. I mean, the thing is that I don't think that Western countries would, nor do I think they should have agreed to this. So there is one hypothesis is that the Russians put into the deal a very strong security guarantee, knowing that the West would not agree, and so that they could blame the West for the failure of negotiation. Another possibility is that the guarantees were essentially meaningless, as often happens for like this type of stuff. And the reason why Ukraine stopped the negotiations is either because they were dissuaded from continuing by the West, which is like the theory of like Johnson's visit, or because they thought they could win, or like it came from the West and Ukraine. But we don't have, based on the information that's publicly available, I don't think we are in a position to determine which of those hypotheses is correct. And it kind of drives me crazy that nobody's looking at this. Like, look, what I'm talking about. Like, this is something that in principle could be, if not settled with certainty, at least we could get a much better idea if we look precisely what those clauses were.
Yes.
People have the document, like the Wall Street Journal had the document. So, well, it's just crazy to me that we don't. But I think like what I will say is that I think people are way too quick to assume that the Russians were not serious about negotiation. I think there's a fair chance that Putin thought by then that he didn't, because people assume he had those maximally aimed, but I think the evidence that he has is very poor. And I think there is a fair chance that he thought he had made his point at this point, and that he could have stopped with like a guarantee that Ukraine would not pursue NATO. I mean, I think it was stupid because he would have gotten a piece of paper. Nothing could have stopped the Ukrainians from like violating yet later, unless depends on the detail of, for instance, the limitations on armament and stuff like that was also included in the deal. But like, depending on the detail, they could very much have violated that stuff later. So it would have been a guarantee in a limited sense. But anyway, look, it's certainly you can make this argument. It's a reason why I thought he wouldn't invade too. I mean, because he had no way of enforcing whatever it would force people to sign. So you can make this argument. It's the same argument for saying he wouldn't have invaded, but he did invade. So that's not an argument to say that he couldn't have been serious about this kind of deal. So I think, there is a fair chance that he was serious. Recently there was this article in the New York Times about how in the fall of 2022, after the successful counteroffensive by the Ukrainians that took back a lot of territory, U.S. intelligence got wind of, serious discussions apparently in the Russian government about using a nuclear weapon against Ukraine if they couldn't like stop them from, for instance, taking Crimea. I mean, I think it was unlikely to happen, but apparently, the U.S. intelligence caught some stuff saying that there were like some serious discussion about this. So they got really worried, as you can imagine. And so they sent Burns, the director of the CIA, to talk to Narishkin, like vis-a-vis in Russia, and apparently, so the Russians agreed to the meeting. And when Narishkin arrived, apparently was convinced that Burns was here to negotiate an armistice.
Yeah.
And it took a while, according to Burns, it took a while before he could convince him that no, actually, the reason he was here had nothing to do with it, because he wanted to send us to let the Russians know that if they used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, there would be consequences. But he had to convince them that he had no intention of like negotiating a ceasefire at this point.
It's a good example.
That's another.
This is a good example of one side really not having a good understanding of the strategic intent of the other side, right? So I think that would be more likely to be the case, because I mean I don't even know how our blob is thinking about something at a given moment. How would you expect the Russians to know exactly, right? So
Yeah. I think. That's. I mean, look, if I had to bet, I think that I would bet that I wouldn't bet a lot, but I would bet that that they are in fact serious about stopping it, because it's become more costly to them than it's worth, And I think like they realize at this point that the cost of like really forcing a decision to impose their terms, whatever those are, and I don't think anybody knows. I actually suspect that themselves don't know what the term their actual goals are, would be too costly, and so they would be open. Like again, they think like it's a lot of it is a status issue. Like they think like if they can force the other side to agree to something like no NATO expansion explicitly in a treaty, it would like satisfy their quest for status, which I think is driving a lot of that stuff. Even though there are also some security components, but. And so I think, if I had to bet, I would say that they are serious about it. I certainly think that we should look at, try, but I also think we won't, because, people, if you try, people are like, oh, you want to reward aggression and blah, 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 is this going to help you? But, you would have to twist the arms of the Ukrainians. People are also not willing to do this, because at this point, the Ukrainians don't want to negotiate yet. It will take more death before they do. And I mean, there's also a fair possibility that the Russians don't really want to either, and that it will also take a lot more death before they're serious about it. Because, I mean, of course, everybody's willing to negotiate if they can get everything they want without having compromise on anything. So when I'm talking about the hypothesis that the Russians are serious about negotiation, I'm talking about the hypothesis that they would be willing to make serious compromises to make a deal. And it's really hard to tell, but anyway, I think no matter what the truth is, it's not going to happen, because we're not going to, because we're very dumb, I mean, the Russians are dumb, but we are too. It's just, I guess we're just less directly affected. So you can argue they're even dumber than us, but that's hardly a consolation if you ask me.
So, we're over 2 hours, and maybe I should not take up too much more of your time, but how about some longer term predictions? So plus 1 year, plus 2 years, and anything that you feel high conviction about that you think is going to happen, either in Ukraine or in Europe, in geopolitics?
I mean, I don't know if like I wouldn't say I'm very confident, but I think I'm reasonably confident that the war is going to last several more years. I think probably at least an extra 5 years. But I also do think that the intensity will decrease, because I think on both sides, they've lost most of their best men in the first 2 years. And I think this matters a lot. And, if you look at World War II, I was reading Blood and Ruin by Richard Overy. It's like this big history of World War II, like his latest book, which is really good. And this huge synthesis from World War II. And he was making this point, which I think was interesting, is that the other things being equal, the fighting ability of units during World War II on all sides decreased over the course of the war, because they lost their best men, and the new recruits were just not as good. But this was more, other things were not equal, because this was more than made up for by the fact that there was absolutely gigantic war production. And so they basically substituted labor for capital, like if we were to use like those economic terms, like in the context of warfare. And so this more than made up for the loss of other things being equal quality of the troops themselves. And I think in this war, we do have the loss of the best men. We also have the loss of equipment, like a lot of it, especially on the Russian side, but also on the Ukrainian side. And but the war production is modest. In fact, nowhere near the kind of like absolutely gargantuous like levels that we saw during World War II. So I think it's not going to make up for the loss of troop quality. So that's why I think that even though I think the war will like continue for like a very long time, my expectation is that the intensity of the war is going to gradually decrease over time. And I think the most likely outcome is that eventually it will be something like what happened during the Korean War, where they will just freeze it. There won't be the Ukraine won't formally acknowledge the loss of territory, but they will just agree to freeze it. And that will be it. But I think it will take longer than in the Korean War, because in the Korean War, the US was fighting directly, which meant that during the ceasefire negotiation, they were the ones pulling the shot on their side. Like the South Koreans, they had to accept whatever the US was saying, because they were the ones the US was doing the bulk of the fighting with the UN troops. And even so, it took 2 years. Remember, it took 2 years before they could get an agreement.
Yep.
So that's why I think like at this time, we're going to have to first reach the point where enough people have died on both sides that they're like, okay, both sides agree that there's no point in continuing. But the point I'm making here is that even after they reach that point, I think it will probably continue for several more years, because then they have to find an agreement. And this won't be easy, especially because, again, since the US is not directly involved in this case, they have less leverage on Ukraine. And so it'll be harder, and especially given the environment, the media and intellectual environment in the West about this. The idea that it's okay to twist the arms of the Ukrainian is like really a non-starter. And so it will be hard, but then who knows? Maybe if Trump is elected, it will change, but I don't think it will fundamentally change things. So my like, to me, the most likely scenario is this, it will like go on, although the intensity will gradually decrease, but go on for several years. And, they will reach a point where they both agree that it's time to stop. But then even after that, the negotiation will drag for years until they get some kind of ceasefire agreement. There is another scenario, which is worse for Ukraine, but I wouldn't rule out either, which is that the Russians, because like the scenario I just outlined is premised on the assumption that the Russians will not drastically increase the amount of resources they allocate to the war, which I think is the most likely thing, because it's difficult for Putin to do so too. But there is a possibility, there's a scenario where they do to like force a decision, and attrition work and breaks, there's just a collapse in the Ukrainian army, and then they're forced to accept like much worse terms. I don't think even in that scenario, Russia, I don't think they can like occupy the whole of Ukraine. It would be too costly, and I like to think that by now they understand how crazy it would be, but who knows? So that's another, and then this would be bad for Europe, because there was this dumb argument in favor of supporting Ukraine that we're gonna like destroy the Russian military on the defeat. That was kind of like first of all, already based on what we spent already, it's not cheap, because people only look at the direct like military, financial, economic assistance. Even that at this point is already pretty sizable, but that's not the worst thing. In Europe, it costs us probably close to $1 trillion, in like government stimulus, to deal with the rise of the price of energy, and again, this is a permanent shock. This is going to be like, this economic effect is going to be affecting us for a while. So there is like, in the scenario where there is a Ukrainian collapse eventually, which is especially likely, although again, I don't think it by far the most likely scenario, but certainly possible. But it's more likely the US can get the adeno processed into Ukraine. Then we'll end up, instead of having like destroyed the Russian military on the field, we'll have like a much larger, much better equipped, et cetera, Russian army closer to our borders. I'm talking about the European, and we'll have to waste a lot of money increasing, defense spending, which look, I mean, it's just like a waste of money, not in the sense that, of course, this also goes to people's salaries and like does contribute to the economy, but like this is those are resources that would be much more productively allocated to other units. But we'll have to do this because look, even someone like me, who is very critical of this like hysteria about like, oh, we need to increase defense spending right now. If we end up with a Russia that armed to the teeth that has been radicalized because we forced it to fight like a very bloody war for years, and it's right on our doorstep. Look, I mean, I still don't think it's very likely they would attack NATO, but like if you're in government, you have to deal with like even unlikely scenario, and we can't just in that case, we can't just ignore the possibility that they will. So we'll have to spend a lot more on defense, and that's just such a waste of resources, just such a complete, the whole thing is a complete waste. So, yeah, that my long term predictions persist. It's basically this. I mean, there is also a scenario where like attrition breaks Russia, which I think is also not totally impossible, although I think it's much less likely at this point.
Great. Well, if the war drags on, the one good point will be that you can turn your articles into a book.
Yeah, that's, I'm kind of thinking about it.
I mean, if you do the work for these long articles, you may as well just write a book on
yeah, I mean, just the first part is already a small book, really. So when I put all them together, it's going to be a big book.
Great. Well, it's been very enlightening talking to you, Philippe, and I think
it's great talking to you.
And
thanks for having me.
When are you next in the U.S.?
Actually, I'm in the U.S. right now. I arrived like a few days ago.
Oh, you're kidding? Are you in Ithaca?
No, I'm in D.C. I'm in D.C. until the beginning of April, basically.
I see. All right. Well, I wish you the best, and I'll let you know when this episode airs.
Great. Thank you.